Dorothea Ashford was 76 years old when her eldest son looked her straight in the eyes and said the land was worthless, not a stranger, not some slick realtor trying to lowball her at a closing table. Her own son, Porter, 48 years old, sitting there in his linen blazer with the gold wedding band catching the fluorescent light. A ring she'd helped pay for back when he married into money and wanted to look the part. Standing beside him in that lawyer's office were the other three, Jolene Branch and Laverne, the four children of Dorothea and Emmett Ashford, the four heirs who, in the 3 weeks since their father's funeral, had already begun the careful work of dividing ranches and cattle and bank accounts and trucks and farm equipment among themselves like poker players splitting a pot, each one walking away with more than most working men could build in 3 lifetimes. And to Dorothea, the woman who had stitched together every cent of that fortune while Emmett built, and the children grew what remained was a yellowed envelope, a deed to 25 acres in Llano County, and a key so rusted you could barely tell what lock it belonged to. 25 acres of scrubland 150 miles from the house where she had spent the last 42 years of her life. Property that had belonged to Emmett's grandfather, that no one in the family had visited in decades, that no one could describe beyond vague gestures and half-remembered stories. Branch had shrugged when she asked about it. Said he thought there were some ruins out there. Said he wasn't even sure there was a road in. Dorothea stood in that conference room holding the key, and she didn't know yet what she was going to find when she put it into a lock that hadn't been opened in 40 years. She didn't know that the man she had loved for 55 years, the man who never learned how to say the right words at the right time, had spent his entire adult life keeping something safe for her. She didn't know that beneath a century-old cypress tree in the middle of that scrubland, her children dismissed there was a metal barrel holding the most valuable secret she could ever imagine. She didn't know that Emmett's monthly trips, the ones he called going to check on some cattle, had nothing whatsoever to do with cattle. She didn't know yet. But she was about to find out. Dorothea Honoria Braga was born on a Tuesday in December of 1948 in a small town in the Texas Hill Country, about 11 miles from the nearest place you could call a city. She was the third of 7 children born to Benedict Braga, a subsistence farmer who worked land that barely wanted to cooperate, and to her mother, Camilla, a small, tough woman hard as Riverstone who cooked beans in a clay pot and ran the household with a quiet order that neither her husband nor her children dared to question. Dorothea's childhood was the childhood of millions of girls who grew up in rural America in those years, up before the roosters, helping her mother before school, learning early that what couldn't be bought had to be made with your own hands. But there was something in Dorothea that set her apart from her siblings from the beginning, a meticulous attention to the world around her. While other children played without noticing things, Dorothea observed. She watched how her father planted, how her mother sewed, how the neighbor woman made cheese that she sold at the local market every Saturday morning. She wanted to know the how of everything. Not out of ambition, not yet. Out of curiosity. Because the world seemed to her like a mechanism that, if well understood, could be managed. By age 11, she was already sewing her own clothes and her younger siblings' clothes too. Stitches still uneven and crooked, but with a patience that turned heads. Her elementary school teacher told Camilla once that this girl has a mind that never stops, that she's gonna go far. Her mother had smiled halfway and said she hoped far wasn't so far that she couldn't send her back to the kitchen when she needed her. The local school only went through 6th grade, After that, there was no way to keep studying. The next school was too far to walk, too expensive for the family to afford room and board. Dorothea folded her notebooks, put her leftover pencils in a jar on the kitchen shelf, and went to work the fields with her father. She was 13 years old. From 13 to 18, Dorothea's life was shaped by a routine that would have exhausted anyone. Up at 4:30 in the morning to help her mother with breakfast, work the cornfield and the bean plots with her father, and older brothers until noon, the sun climbing higher and hotter with every hour. Back to the house to make lunch. Then afternoons spent sewing for others. Hems and patches and alterations for a few cents she handed entirely to her mother without keeping a thing. Sundays meant church when there was a way to get there, and an afternoon of rest she usually spent reading. The same old 3-week-old newspaper, the same worn Bible, the same comic books her older brothers passed around. She didn't complain. She was not the kind of person who complained. She was the kind of person who did. Emmett Augustus Ashford entered Dorothea's life on a July afternoon in 1967, when she was 18 and he was 22. He was from a town about 15 miles over, the son of a respected cattleman named Cypress, a man who had worked the land for decades and built a reputation as solid as the wooden fences on his properties. Emmett was the eldest of Cyrus's children and had inherited from his father not only the good name, but also the character. A man of few words, generous in action, with dark, calm eyes that made people feel they could trust him without knowing exactly why. They met in a general store in town where Dorothea had gone with her mother to buy salt and cornmeal. She was reaching for a can of lard on the top shelf when Emmett passed by with a sack of feed over his shoulder, accidentally bumped the shelf with his elbow, and knocked 3 cans rolling across the packed dirt floor. Dorothea bent down to help pick them up. Emmett bent down too. They both stood at the same moment and found themselves face to face close enough that Dorothea could see the early gray threads at his temples, though he was young. "Excuse me," he said. "No problem," she replied. It wasn't a lightning bolt. It wasn't trumpets or violins. It was a can of lard rolling across a dirt floor in a general store on a July afternoon that smelled like dust and dried herbs. But Emmett Ashford turned back before walking out the door and looked at Dorothea in a way that made her understand that look would come back. And it did. 3 weeks later, Emmett went to her father's farm to ask if he could court his daughter. Her father said yes without much ceremony. He knew the Ashford family, knew Cyrus, knew the son was a hard worker. Dorothea's mother looked Emmett over from head to boot and then told her daughter that night that this man is serious and that's what matters. The courtship was like courtships of that time and place. Sunday afternoon visits. Conversation in the living room with family nearby. No rush, no drama. Emmett was a man of few words. Dorothea discovered that quickly, but what he said was true. He didn't promise what he couldn't deliver. He didn't tell stories to impress her. When he came to visit, he came with fruit from the orchard or a jar of honey, sat in the chair her father set out in the living room and stayed there. Present, without needing to fill the silence with words. It seemed strange to her at first. She was used to the noise of siblings, the constant bustle of a large family. Emmett's silence felt like an absence, a gap. But with time, she began to understand it wasn't emptiness. It was solidity. Emmett didn't talk because he didn't need to. What he wanted to say, he said with presence. They married in March of 1969 in a simple ceremony at the local church. Dorothea wore a dress she had sewn herself, white satin with lace at the sleeves. 8 yards of fabric she had bought with 2 years' worth of sewing money. Her mother cried. Her father gripped his new son-in-law's hand with both of his own and said, "Take care of her." Emmett simply answered, "You can count on me, sir," and they went to live in a small room on Cyrus's ranch. 2 rooms, a dirt floor, a wood-burning stove, a window that didn't close properly and let in the cold of winter nights. Dorothea didn't complain. She had never had much more than that. She took that little room and within 3 months had whitewashed the walls, hung cloth curtains where the broken window had been planted an herb garden out front, and built a chicken coop in the back. The first years were tight, but not miserable. Emmett worked with his father in the cattle business, driving herds, mending fences, trading livestock at local markets. Dorothea sewed for others, tended chickens, and a pig they kept in the yard, and began making tamales and tortillas and cornbread that her sister-in-law sold for her at a market stall in town. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. In 1970, Porter was born. In 72, Jolene. In 75, Branch. In 78, Laverne. Each child arrived at a different moment in their lives, at a different rung of stability. Porter came when they were still poor. Dorothea nursed him sometimes without enough to eat herself, but she never let the milk run out. Jolene came when things were starting to improve, when Emmett had inherited a small 20-acre parcel from his father and had his own cattle. Branch arrived in a time of plenty. Emmett had sold a good lot and bought more land, a ranch of nearly 175 acres, and life had taken on the smell of a prosperity they hadn't known before. Laverne arrived already in a brick house with a cement floor, an indoor bathroom, and a refrigerator. Dorothea accompanied every step of that rise, not as a spectator, but as a builder. When Emmett needed money to buy his first herd, it was Dorothea's sewing money that made up the difference. When the ranch needed corral repairs, it was Dorothea who managed the household so tightly that there was margin left over to pay the labor. When the children went to school in the city, it was Dorothea's food orders, which had grown from a market stall into regular catering for bakeries and parties, that paid part of the tuition and the student housing. She never asked for recognition. She was not the kind of woman who counted what she gave, but she counted it internally with a quiet precision, because life had taught her that whoever doesn't track what they invest eventually gets surprised by what's missing. Emmett, for his part, grew. The cattle hand who had come to that little 2-room shack became a respected rancher in the region. In the 80s and 90s, while inflation ate away at what people had, Emmett had the instinct to put his money in land, and land always held its value. He bought a parcel here, negotiated a division there, traded one ranch that wasn't producing for 2 that were about to appreciate. By the time the 2000s came around, Emmett Ashford owned nearly 865 acres of good land, a herd of 400 head, 3 trucks, farm equipment, and a bank account that never hit zero. The children grew up inside that prosperity, knowing there was wealth, but believing it had all come from their father's work alone. Emmett never corrected them. Neither did Dorothea, not out of wounded pride, but out of a kind of indifference to claiming credit for what was simply the life she had chosen to live. But there were things Dorothea didn't know about Emmett. things he kept in the silence that was his native language. There were the monthly trips, for example. Every first Saturday of the month, with a regularity you could set a calendar by, Emmett would get up before sunrise, put on old clothes, take the oldest truck. A 1992 pickup he refused to sell. Even when he bought a newer one and disappear, he always came back Sunday night with the truck covered in country road dust boots, caked with mud, and a tiredness in his eyes that didn't look like the tiredness of a man who had gone to check on cattle. When Dorothea asked what he'd been doing, he always said the same thing. Went to look at some young bulls at the old place. And Dorothea, who had learned to read Emmett's silences better than he could himself, always sensed there was a second layer to that answer. Not a lie. An omission. A deliberate omission that was not cruelty, but was definitely a secret. She never pushed him. She trusted him. 50 years of marriage create a kind of faith that doesn't need an explanation every single day. There was also the study Emmett had set up in the 1990s in a small room of their house once the family had moved to the city. A small room with a dark wood desk shelves full of folders and documents, a large map of the state pinned to the wall with thumbtacks. The door had no lock. Emmett never locked anything, but there was an unspoken understanding that this was his space. Dorothea went in to clean dusted the shelves, didn't disturb his papers, not because he had ever asked her not to, but because there was something in that office that smelled like private territory, like thoughts not yet ready to be shared. Once in early March of 2001, Dorothea went to clean the study and noticed one of the folders had fallen open on the desk, blown by the breeze from the half-open window. Without meaning to before she closed it, she read the header on the top document: Hydrological Assessment Report, Rural Property, Llano County. Springs identified 4. Dorothea looked at the page for a second, didn't understand what it meant. Closed the folder, put it back on the shelf. She swept the office, closed the window, and went to make lunch. She didn't think about it again that day, but the name Llano settled into a small corner of her memory, quiet and still waiting to be called. As the years passed, the children drifted further away. Not in miles, since 3 of the 4 still lived nearby, but in presence, in attention, in care. Porter, the oldest, had become a real estate agent in the city and married a woman from a wealthy family who didn't hide very well the fact that she found her in-laws too countrified. Jolene had moved to the city, married a government employee named Eli, and had children who came to visit their grandparents at Christmas, with the careful politeness of someone taught to be grateful, but not to feel. Branch stayed in the area, became a veterinarian, and was the one who showed up most often. Not out of any special affection for his mother, Dorothea sensed, but because small towns don't have many roads, and they always ended up crossing. Laverne, the youngest, had gone to the city to study architecture, came back, married a city man, and had twin children Dorothea adored, the joy of her life as a grandmother. But Laverne in recent years had become too busy for long phone calls. There were magnificent Christmases in that family. There were Sunday lunches where the table was full and the noise was good. There were moments when Dorothea looked at those grown children and adult grandchildren and felt it had all been worth it. Every stitch. Every late night waiting for Emmett to come home from market. But there was also Christmas of 2014, when Porter arrived with his wife and 2 teenage children and spent the entire afternoon on his phone, while Dorothea spent hours in the kitchen making the mole sauce he had specifically requested. When lunch was ready and Dorothea called everyone to the table, Porter appeared, still holding his phone, and said to his wife, not quietly enough, "I can't stand this heat in here. Why doesn't this woman ever buy air conditioning?" Dorothea heard. She pretended not to have. She served the mole with steady hands. There was Dorothea's 70th birthday in December of 2018. She had asked for only one thing: that all 4 children come. Porter sent flowers with a little note of apology. Prior commitment. Jolene came, stayed 3 hours, left before dinner. Branch came with his wife and slipped out before the cake. Laverne was the one who stayed longest until 9 o'clock, but spent much of it taking calls from her husband, who, from what Dorothea overheard, was having problems with an apartment they were renovating. Emmett had ordered a 3-tiered birthday cake that day, cream frosting with sugar roses. He stayed by Dorothea's side all evening. When the last guests left and the 2 of them were alone in the living room with the remains of the cake and glasses of water on the table, Emmett took her hand and said, "Happy birthday, Dorothea." She looked at him. 50 years of marriage. A 73-year-old man with aged hands and completely white hair, and still in his eyes that quiet thing she had recognized the very first time she saw him in that store, when the cans of lard rolled across the floor. "Thank you," she said. That was the best part of the day, not the party, not the flowers Porter had sent, not the hurried hugs from the children who left early. Emmett's hand in hers in the silence of the disheveled living room. Emmett died on August 18th, 2024, a Sunday. He was 79. His heart simply stopped the way good engines stop after many years of work. Without warning. Without struggle. He had gone to bed on Friday saying he was tired more than usual. Dorothea asked if he was all right. He said yes. He died Sunday morning when she brought the coffee she made for him every day. Thick coffee, fresh bread, white cheese, the slow-brewed coffee he liked. Emmett didn't wake up. Dorothea stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a time she couldn't measure afterward, holding the tray with both hands, looking at the man she had slept beside for 55 years. She felt something that was simultaneously the worst thing she had ever felt, and in a strange and guilty way a kind of peace, because he had left without pain, in his sleep, the way he deserved to go. Then she set the tray on the dresser, sat on the edge of the bed, took his still warm hand, and stayed there until she knew she had to call the children. The children arrived with a speed that surprised Dorothea, not just for the funeral itself, though they came quickly for that too. What surprised her was the speed with which they arrived for the inventory. Emmett died on a Sunday. By Monday afternoon, while Dorothea was still at the wake, sitting in a plastic chair, staring at the casket, Porter was already in a corner of the room speaking in low tones, with branch papers folded in the pocket of his jacket. Dorothea didn't hear what they were saying. She thought it was about the burial arrangements. She thought it was about her, that her children were planning how to care for her in those first hard days. It wasn't about her. Or rather, it was. But it wasn't about caring. The burial was Tuesday under a merciless sun. Family came, old friends, people Emmett had done business with for decades, faces Dorothea recognized from the life they had built together. The service was at the same church where they had married, and the priest who had known the couple for years said words that made Dorothea cry in a way she tried to control and couldn't. In the 3 days that followed the burial, the house stayed full. Neighbors brought food. Friends came to sit with her. Branch and his wife stayed in the guest room. Porter and his wife stayed at a hotel. His wife said she preferred a hotel, and Dorothea understood what that meant, but said nothing. Jolene and her husband stayed in Jolene's old room, which still had the same curtains Dorothea had hung there when Jolene was a girl. On Thursday, a week after Emmett's death, Porter asked everyone to gather in the living room. It was 6 o'clock in the evening. Dorothea was in the kitchen finishing the lunch dishes. She dried her hands on her apron, took it off, folded it, set it on the chair, and went to the living room. They were all there. Porter sitting in the leather armchair, the one Dorothea had bought at a furniture store years ago, paid off in 18 installments. His wife in a corner, motionless with the air of someone who already knew what was coming. Jolene and Eli on the smaller sofa. Branch standing near the bookcase. Laverne in one of the few remaining seats, knees pressed together, with an expression Dorothea couldn't quite classify. Not exactly guilt. Not exactly discomfort. Something in between. Mom said, Porter opening a folder. "We need to talk about the estate and about Dad's assets." Dorothea looked at him. She looked at the papers. She sat down in the small armchair near the window, the one where Emmett used to sit on Sunday afternoons reading the newspaper, and said, "Go ahead." Porter spoke. He spoke about the properties, the ranches, the cattle, the equipment, the trucks, the bank accounts. Everything listed with estimated values a lawyer friend had drawn up. As he spoke, Dorothea perceived with that quiet precision that had been her companion her whole life, that the division he was proposing was a division among the 4 children, not among the 5 heirs, not between the 4 children and her. "And me?" she asked at some point, cutting through Porter's monologue. There was a 2 or 3 second silence that lasted longer than it lasted. "The law provides that you keep half." Porter said the way you deliver bad news. "We'll divide the rest among ourselves." "Half of what?" Porter turned a page. "There are some properties here we consider less significant. Those would be your portion. There's a little ranch out in Llano County, for example. It belonged to Dad's great-grandfather. We're not looking to fight this out in court, Mom. That's not what this is about. The idea is to do it amicably." Dorothea looked at him. Amicably. The word landed with a weight Porter had certainly not calculated. "How much is the Llano place worth?" she asked. "Oh, Mom, that's nothing," Branch said from his corner. "It's scrubland. 40 years abandoned. No decent fence. No livable house. Nothing planted." "How much is it worth?" Porter checked his papers. "The estimate is $32,000. Dorothea was silent. $32,000. The value her children had calculated as the fair share for the woman who had sewn, cooked, managed, saved, and given up sleep for 55 years beside Emmett Ashford. She listened as Porter laid out the rest. The ranches divided 4 ways: trucks, cattle, farm equipment, bank accounts, everything parceled out among the 4 children. To Dorothea, the abandoned Llano County property, 25 acres, appraised at $32,000, no livable house, no electricity, no proper access road, and the city house to live in for as long as she lived on the condition that upon her death it would revert to the heirs, as if the house where she had planted the garden, painted the walls, sewn the curtains, buried Jolene's favorite cat in the backyard, as if it were a temporary courtesy, a lifetime pension in a place that was already theirs. Dorothea looked at Porter for a long moment. Then she looked at Jolene studying the floor, at Branch scrolling his phone, at Laverne, who met her eyes for a second and then looked away. "Did you plan this before your father died?" Dorothea asked. "Mom, I'm asking a simple question." "We talked about what would be fair," said Porter with the controlled voice of a man being reasonable. "Dad was the patriarch. His name was on the assets. We needed to have a plan. You planned the inventory." Mom said Laverne for the first time quietly. "It's not about planning. It's about organization." Dorothea looked at her. Her youngest. The one who had stayed longest on her 70th birthday. The one who sometimes called on Thursday afternoons just to talk. The one who seemed the most human of the four, sitting there contributing to the same division. "I need to think," said Dorothea. She stood up from the armchair, went to her bedroom, closed the door gently, and stood in the center of the darkness for a time she could not measure. In the 3 weeks that followed, the house slowly emptied. Not all at once, but in a calculated, gradual way, like a tide pulling sand from a beach without you noticing the beach is disappearing. Porter returned to the city a few days after the meeting, but not before taking the documents from Emmett's study. The folders, the maps, the files from the shelves. Dorothea saw him carrying the large black folder and said, "What folder is that?" Porter said it was property documents that he was going to organize everything for the inventory. Dorothea said she wanted everything left there until the estate was settled. Porter said, "Of course, Mom," and put the folder in his car anyway. Branch spent 3 days going back and forth to the main ranch counting cattle. When he finished, 400 head had become 386 on paper. The rest had apparently been sick and died the month before. The resulting split was slightly distorted in Branch's favor. The newer truck disappeared from the garage in the 2nd week. Porter needed it for work. Dorothea kept the older car, her car, the one she had bought with her own sewing money, and had never put in Emmett's name. Jolene called one Friday to say that her husband had remembered Emmett had once promised her the porcelain service from the dining room hutch. "You remember, Mom?" "Dad said it the last time we visited." Dorothea looked at the hutch and saw the service Emmett had given her on their 35th anniversary, brought back from a trip to the city, specifically for that occasion. Emmett never promised that service to anyone, Dorothea said. "Mom, I'm certain he said it." A silence. "That service stays here." Jolene hung up without saying goodbye. Laverne sent a text message asking if Dorothea was going to need the study, because she and her husband were thinking that since Dorothea was staying in the house anyway, that room could become a guest suite for when the grandchildren visited. Dorothea replied, "The study stays as it is." Laverne didn't respond. The day she signed the estate papers, sitting at a notary's office with Porter's lawyer beside her, a young, smiling man who was clearly not her lawyer, Dorothea signed what had to be signed. Not because she agreed, not because she had accepted, but because she understood that a legal battle would take years, cost what she didn't have, and the uncertain outcome would be far more draining than the certain humiliation. But before signing the last page, She told the lawyer I want the Wano County property transferred to my name immediately. Of course, Mrs. Ashford, the young man said. That's part of the arrangement. Immediately, she repeated, looking at him directly until he looked away. The next day, she called the only friend she knew she could ask. Wallace Brennan, 71 years old. Her neighbor of 40 years. A man of quiet strength that matched Dorothea's own. Wallace had been a widower for 5 years and had an old truck. But it ran. Wally, Dorothea said when he answered, I need a favor. Whatever you need. Dorothea looked at the house. The windows she had painted white 3 years before. The garden she had planted flower by flower. The front door with the brass handle Emmett had replaced on their 40th anniversary. Because the old one had rusted. She picked up the suitcase she had packed the night before. Not a large one, just a medium bag. Because Dorothea Ashford didn't need much to leave. She put it in the back of Wallace's truck and headed for Llano County at 76 years old with $8,300 in her account. A yellowed envelope with an old deed and a rusty key that no one had wanted. The road was the kind that maps know better than the pavement does. The first stretch was reasonable. State highway with lane markings. After the second town, the asphalt began to narrow to show decades of winters without maintenance patched on top of each other. And when they were about 25 miles from Clearwater, the GPS started directing them down dirt roads that the land interpreted as a personal challenge. It was late January. The winter sun was not a suggestion. It was an assertion. The sky a hard, unbroken blue. The heat came in horizontally through the windows because Wallace's air conditioning had stopped working the week before and still hadn't been fixed. The landscape rolling by outside was Texas countryside in full. Yellow grass, dried trees, ravines cut into the horizon like frames of a painting that never ended. There was beauty in it that Dorothea recognized. She had grown up in this land. She had smelled this warm wind of earth and dry leaf since she was a girl. But today the beauty passed through her like through glass. She was looking outward but watching inward. Are you all right? Wallace asked at some point. Yes. You don't look it. I'm thinking. About what Dorothea took a moment. About what he knew that I didn't know. Wallace didn't ask who he was. He knew it was Emmett. They arrived in Clearwater at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. A small town, about 6,000 people. A main street with a pharmacy, a grocery, a gas station. A plaza with a green and white gazebo. A parish church with its doors open. Dorothea stopped Wallace at the plaza and got out to ask a woman sweeping the sidewalk how to get to the property. She had the name from the deed. Santa Rosa Ranch, a rural lane off the east side of town. The woman who introduced herself as Ruby, somewhere in her 60s, paused on her broom when she heard the name. She looked at Dorothea with an expression Dorothea couldn't classify in that moment. A mix of recognition and surprise. Santa Rosa Ranch. That's the one belonging to Mr. Emmett Ashford. Dorothea felt her heart turn over. It was my husband's. Emmett passed away 3 weeks ago. Ruby stood still for a second. Then she said, I'm so sorry, ma'am. Mr. Emmett was a good man. He used to come here every month, you know, every first Saturday. We knew him by sight. A pause. Are you going to the ranch now? Yes. Ruby gave detailed directions. out of the plaza down the street with the jacaranda trees. Take the rural lane beside the abandoned grain silo. Follow 4 miles of dirt road until you reach a wooden gate with a large cypress tree at the entrance. You'll recognize the cypress, she said. It's the biggest one in the region. You can't miss it. In the truck, Wallace said quietly, "Every first Saturday of the month." Dorothea didn't respond. But something was settling in her chest. A decades-old puzzle beginning to place its first pieces. The dirt road was the kind the countryside produces naturally. Red compacted earth worn down by years of tires. Brush growing on both sides and meeting overhead like a natural archway. The truck groaned over the bumps, stirred up clouds of dust through the half-open windows, and Wallace gripped the wheel with both hands. After 4 miles that felt longer because time on a bad road always runs slower than it should, the gate appeared. It was wooden, old, but standing. And beside it, planted at the exact midpoint between the road and the property entrance, stood the cypress. Dorothea lowered her window and looked at that tree. It was enormous, trunk thick as a column, gray and furrowed bark, a massive canopy spreading its branches in every direction like someone opening their arms to embrace. No flowers at that time of year, but a presence in it that was more than botanical. A presence Dorothea couldn't name but felt rising up through her feet and into her body. Dorothea opened the door, took the rusty key, and entered Santa Rosa Ranch for the first time in her life. What Dorothea saw on the other side of that gate was not exactly what she had imagined. It was worse. But also, in a way, she couldn't yet articulate something more. The vegetation had claimed everything. 40 years of land without human hands is 40 years of land doing what land does best: growing, tangling, covering, reclaiming. The old internal path that led from the gate to where the house must have been was today a covered trail, visible only because the ancient compacted ground resisted the brush better than the surrounding terrain. You could follow it if you knew to look down instead of ahead, because ahead there was only vegetation, native grass, scrub bushes, a few guava trees heavy with small fruit, a palm that had sprouted from some wind-carried seed and grown twisted, but persistent. Wallace stayed beside the truck with the keys in his hand, staring. "This is going to need clearing," Dorothea said. "Come on, Wally." Dorothea got out and walked down the old trail, ducking under low branches, pushing brush aside with her arm, where there was no other way through. She was wearing sneakers, not by a hiker's choice, but because that's what she had on that day, because she hadn't known exactly what she'd find. The tall grass soaked her pants to the knee with dew that hadn't dried even at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because the dense vegetation held the moisture of the night like a sponge. The house appeared after about 500 feet. Calling it a house was generous. Branch had been right to say ruins. It was a construction of maybe 400 square feet. Walls still standing in their basic timber frame, but with the mud fill fallen out in several places, leaving gaps you could see through. The roof, which had been clay tile, had collapsed in the center, and at the front, where a covered porch must have been, now a pile of rotted boards and broken tiles that the brush had gently absorbed. The door, a solid wood door that remarkably still stood in its frame decades after it was hung, was closed with a rusted chain and a padlock that looked to be from the same era as the key in Dorothea's pocket. But Dorothea didn't look at the ruins first. She looked at the cypress. Because the cypress was inside the property, the enormous tree she had seen at the entrance was in the center of what must have been the courtyard within the fenced boundary. The old barbed wire and wooden post fence had all fallen, but the stones marking the property lines were still in place, and the tree had a size that seemed impossible for anything less than very, very old. Emmett had mentioned once years before in a lunchtime conversation that Dorothea hadn't filed with any particular attention that there was a tree on his grandfather's property that must be around 150 years old. She had said it sounded beautiful. He had agreed and changed the subject. This cypress was 150 years old, maybe more. The late afternoon sun hit it from the side, and the enormous canopy cast a circular shadow on the red earth. A shadow that looked like a sundial, a clock that measured not hours but presence. There was something about the ground beneath that canopy that caught Dorothea's attention. The earth there was different, not the 40-year abandoned brush that covered the rest of the terrain. The grass there was shorter, thinner, as if someone had passed through not so very long ago. But that would come later. First, there was the door. Dorothea approached the wooden door, looked at the padlock, and took the rusty key from her pocket. The key and the lock were from the same era, same copper oxidation, same old-fashioned style. She put the key in carefully, as if too much force might break something. The key turned. Not on the first try. She had to apply pressure, and there was a metallic screech of decades of rust yielding unwillingly, but it turned. The padlock opened. The chain fell. Dorothea took the iron handle heavy and cold, despite the heat, and pushed. The door opened with a slow creak that would have been dramatic if it hadn't been genuine. The interior was dark. The few windows the structure had were broken and boarded from the inside, letting in only thin oblique shafts of light that cut the darkness like narrow spotlights. It smelled of old wood and earth and a cool dampness, the smell of a space that had been closed a long time, but had somehow taken care not to rot. That detail, the not rotting, the smell of preservation rather than decay, was the first sign Dorothea noticed without being able to explain. Wallace had come up behind her and stood in the doorway looking over her shoulder. "Is there an animal in there?" he asked. "I'm going to see." Dorothea took out her phone and turned on the flashlight. She swept the interior. It was a single space naturally divided into two parts by the arrangement of the old furniture still standing there. A side that had been the living area and kitchen with a solid mesquite wood table, darkened by time but not destroyed, and two old chairs still standing, and a smaller area toward the back that had been a bedroom with an iron cot fallen on its side, its feet still anchored to the crude cement floor by accumulated rust. The floor was cement, not dirt as Dorothea had supposed from outside. Hand-smoothed cement, cracked in several places but solid enough to walk on. The interior walls were mesquite wood planks, still firm after 40 years. And on the back wall, on the one separating the interior from the rear of the structure, there was something that made Dorothea stop. A shelf. A simple wooden shelf nailed to the wall with 3 levels. And on the shelf there were objects. This was not a shelf of abandonment, not what remains when a place is forgotten. A random collection of things that outlasted their owner. This was a shelf organized with purpose. Dorothea approached slowly and brought light close. On the first level, a sealed can of ground coffee with a date written in pen on the lid. January 2024. 7 months ago. Next to the can, a bundle of candles in closed cellophane, a box of matches, a small bag of salt. On the second level, a sealed bottle of water, a sealed package of butter cookies, a small tin of tuna. On the third level, a thick white envelope, edges lightly yellowed, with writing on the front in the handwriting Dorothea would recognize anywhere. The handwriting that had signed checks and contracts and birthday cards for 55 years. For Dorothea, open when you arrive. Dorothea stood looking at that envelope for a time she couldn't measure. Wallace, who had come in behind her and was watching the shelf in the flashlight's glow, said in a low voice, "Good Lord." Dorothea took the envelope. Her hands were steady. She noticed that. She noticed that her hands weren't shaking, and didn't know whether that was strength or shock. She held the envelope carefully, as if its weight were different from its physical weight. She looked at Emmett's handwriting one more time. For Dorothea, open when you arrive. He had known she would come. He had prepared. But the envelope was not the only thing that was in that ranch. She would discover that later. In that moment, Wallace pulled Dorothea gently back outside. "Dorothea, it's getting dark. We can't stay here in the dark. Let's go into town, find a place to sleep, and come back first thing tomorrow morning." Dorothea looked through the window. Wallace was right. The country sun was leaving with the same brutality it had arrived with. Fast. Without farewell. She went. She spent the night at the only lodging in Clearwater, a guest house on the main square, run by a woman named Odette Rivers, who Dorothea perceived with a surprise that was no longer quite surprise. The woman knew Emmett by name. "Mr. Emmett used to stay here every first Saturday of the month," Odette said in the tone of someone confirming what is already known. A good guest. Left the room tidy. Paid in advance. Never any trouble. A pause. "I'm very sorry for your loss, ma'am." He was a man of real respect. Dorothea thanked her and went to her room with the envelope in her hand. She sat on the bed, put the envelope on her knees, and looked at it for some time. Then she opened it. Inside there were two things: a bundle of documents folded together with a rubber band, and a letter. Many pages written in Emmett's firm, large hand in blue ink on lined stationery. Dorothea recognized the paper. It was the same kind he used when signing contracts. She set the documents aside without looking at them for now, and began to read the letter. Part 2. The Hidden Legacy. Dorothea sat on the edge of the bed in that small room in Odette Rivers's guest house, holding pages that felt heavier than paper should feel, and began to read in the lamplight. The handwriting was Emmett's, unmistakable. The same careful script he'd used to write her birthday cards, to sign the deed when they bought their first piece of land together, to leave notes on the kitchen table when he had to leave before dawn. But there was something different about these pages. A deliberation. A weight to each word that told her he had chosen them with more care than he'd ever chosen words in life. "Dorothea," the letter began, "I never knew how to write beautifully. You know that. 55 years, and you know better than anyone that my words always came out sideways, rushed when there should have been calm. silent when I should have spoken. So I'm writing here slowly because in writing I think better than in speaking. If you're reading this, it's because you came to Santa Rosa Ranch. It's because the kids did what I always knew they would do. And you took what was left and went. I prepared for that. Not with anger toward them. I can't have anger for them anymore. They are my children. I raised them. Some of the blame for what they are, I carry myself. But I prepared with the clarity of someone who knows the people he raised and knows what they will do when the moment comes. You deserve to know everything. So I'm going to tell you everything from the beginning. Santa Rosa Ranch belonged to my grandfather, Augustus, who inherited it from his father who cleared that land. Before Clearwater was Clearwater, when it was just nameless countryside, belonging to whoever had the courage to stay. My grandfather Augustus planted that cypress with his own hands when he was 30 years old. That was around 1905. The tree is over 100 years old today. I know you saw it when you arrived. There's no way not to see it. When my grandfather died in 1948, the same year you were born, Dorothea, and that is not coincidence. That is something I've always thought about. The ranch passed to my father, Cyrus. My father never had much interest in that land. He liked to move, not stay. So the ranch was visited less and less until by the time I was in my 20s and went out there for the first time with an uncle. It was already in the state you found it, half abandoned, the house starting to fall. But on that visit, I did one thing that changed everything. I drank water from a spring. It sounds simple, but it was late July, brutal heat. And my uncle and I had been walking the property a long time. He took me to the back of the terrain where there's a low hollow that floods partially in the rainy months. He showed me where the water came up out of the ground. This water is special, he said. Your grandfather Augustus knew it was special. He said it was medicine, and I drank. And Dorothea, I have never tasted water like it. Cold even in summer. Colder than any well I had ever drunk from, with a faint mineral taste that seemed to clean you from the inside. It's not mysticism. I'm not a mystical man, you know that. But it was different. Years later, in 1987, you thought I went to the city to see Branch at the university. But I also went to a geology conference a friend of mine had invited me to. A geologist spoke about aquifers and natural mineral water, the mineralization process, how it's identified, how it's registered. And I sat there with my heart pounding because everything that man described matched exactly what my uncle had showed me 20 years before. I came back from that trip with the name of a hydrogeologist. It cost me a fortune to track him down. He was a professor at the university. I paid for a consultation without telling you. I knew you'd want to know what it was for, but I wasn't ready to explain everything yet. He was worth it. He went to the ranch, ran the tests, came back a month later with his findings. 4 springs, Dorothea. 4. High mineralization index. Perfect pH. Consistent water temperature even in summer. Flow sufficient for commercial production. Real mineral water on our land. Now you'll ask, and why didn't you do anything with that? The honest answer is, I did. In 1991, a company found out about the assessment. I don't know how. They sent a representative to offer me a purchase price. A considerable amount for the time. I took the proposal home, sat at the kitchen table, ran the numbers, and then did what probably seems irrational to anyone on the outside. I refused. I refused because I understood in that moment that this land was not for selling. It was for keeping, and it wasn't for me. I had the ranches. I had the cattle. I didn't need that money to survive. It was for you. I already knew even then, without knowing exactly how, that the kids were going to do what children do when they grow up inside money without learning its value. They were going to want everything and leave you what they judged was worth nothing. So I spent the following years caring for the ranch in secret. I went every month. You always thought it was to check on some cattle. I let you think that because I didn't know how to explain it without explaining everything. And explaining everything before the time was right meant risking that someone would find out. I cleared the brush around the house, kept the structure standing, maintained the springs so they wouldn't be blocked. I never did any visible work, never brought anyone else. Just me and the ranch. Every first Saturday of the month, Dorothea's hands began to shake now. She set the letter down on her lap for a moment, looked at the ceiling, breathed. Every first Saturday. For how long she did the math in her head. 1984 to 2024. 40 years. 40 years of monthly trips. 40 years of him saying he was checking on cattle. 40 years of her trusting him and not asking more. She picked up the letter again. In 2018, after your 70th birthday, I decided I needed to make it official. I went to an attorney in the city, not locally, not here, but in Mexico City to make sure no one in the kids' circle would find out. He helped me do 3 things. First, register the Santa Rosa Ranch in your name, and your name alone as a gift from me to you during my lifetime. This means the land is not part of the estate. It has been yours for 6 years, and the children have no right to a single inch of it. Dorothea stopped reading. Read that paragraph again, a 3rd time. The ranch had been in her name since 2018. 6 years. It was never part of Emmett's estate. It was never theirs to divide. Porter and Branch and Jolene and Laverne had given her what was already hers and acted like they were being generous. She kept reading. Second link, the ranch to a savings account I opened in 1989 and fed monthly since then with small amounts that never drew attention in our accounts. That account, corrected for current values, holds the equivalent of approximately $60,000 today. Third commission, a new geological assessment of the springs, updated and fully documented, with an estimated value for a commercial water use concession. The assessment is in the documents with this letter. The estimated concession value for 20 years on all 4 springs combined is between $240,000 and $320,000. That does not include the value of the land itself, which, with real estate speculation in the region and the interest of major mineral water producers over the last 10 years, is valued between $60,000 and $80,000 for the 25 acres. Dorothea, you were never what was left over. You were what was set aside. I knew from that afternoon in the store when the cans fell, and you bent down to help, that you were the best thing in my life. And I spent the following years afraid of not being worthy of that, afraid of not knowing how to say what needed to be said, afraid of not knowing how to do what needed to be done. I'm not a man of beautiful words. but I am a man of actions. And the most important action I ever took in my life was keeping this place for you. The children took the grazing lands, but those lands, Dorothea, I have to tell you, are in an environmental protection zone since 2019 as part of a protected ecological corridor. They cannot plant, cannot build, and the penalty for irregular use is steep. I didn't set that trap. Nature set it. I simply didn't warn them. The other ranch, the one that went to Porter and Jolene, has an adverse possession lawsuit from a neighboring farmer who has been pursuing a portion of that land for 12 years. My attorney has the case files. They don't know about it. I didn't do this with malice, Dorothea. I did it with justice. There is a difference. You're going to need a good attorney. His name and contact are in the documents. Antonio Valdez, Mexico City. He already knows everything. He's been waiting for your call. And there's one more thing. At the back of the property, about 600 feet past the Cypress, past the hollow, there's a large pink sandstone boulder that my uncle used to call Old Augustus's Stone. Beneath it, according to my uncle, my grandfather had buried what he called the family gold. I don't know what it is. I never dug. I thought it was an old man's legend. But after everything I've discovered about this land, I no longer dismiss anything. You can go see. I love you, Dorothea. I always knew how to say it on the inside. I took too long to learn how to say it on the outside. Forgive me. Your Emmett. Dorothea folded the last page and sat in silence. Then she wept. Not the restrained kind. Not the kind a 76-year-old woman holds back for the sake of dignity. It was the kind that comes from decades accumulated. From every night she had lain awake in the city house listening to the children divide the estate with the speed of vultures and feeling invisible. From every time Porter had stared at his phone while she served the meal she had spent hours making. From every birthday afternoon where the children left early. From 55 years beside a man she had loved, and who had loved her back in a silent and absolute way that she only now completely understood. There was a soft knock at the door. Wallace's voice came through. "Thea, you all right?" Dorothea stood, opened the door. Her face was wet. She didn't care. She handed Wallace the letter without saying anything. Wallace took it, sat in the chair by the window, read. When he finished, he looked up at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something between awe and sadness. "Good God," he said, quietly. He spent 40 years preparing this. Dorothea sat back down on the bed. He knew. He knew what they would do. Wallace set the letter down carefully on the small table. "What do you want to do?" Dorothea wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I want to find proof. The letter's not enough." He said, "There's something under the cypress." Wallace nodded. "Tomorrow morning, then. First light." Dorothea looked at him. "Thank you, Wally, for driving me here, for staying." Wallace stood. Didn't say anything for a moment. "Then you'd have done the same for Sarah. When she was sick. You brought meals every Tuesday for 6 months. Never asked for anything. Just showed up." Dorothea remembered. Sarah Brennan, Wallace's wife. Cancer had taken her slowly. Dorothea had cooked because it was what she knew how to do, what she could offer. That was different, Dorothea said. Wallace shook his head. No, it wasn't. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. He left. Dorothea lay down on the bed, still dressed, staring at the ceiling Emmett's letter on the nightstand beside her. She didn't sleep for a long time, but when she finally did, she dreamed of a cypress tree and cold water rising from the ground. The next morning at 6:30, before the January sun turned merciless, Dorothea was back at Santa Rosa Ranch. The light was different this time. The dawn light in the countryside has a golden quality that midday doesn't have, an angle that makes shadows long and textures leap. That transforms ordinary scrubland into landscape. Wallace had stopped at a hardware store that opened early. A man named Hollis Kane ran it. He sold them a shovel work gloves and a heavy-duty flashlight without asking questions. Just nodded when Dorothea said they were doing some work out at the old Ashford place. Your husband was a good man, Hollis said as he rang up the purchase. Came in here once a month like clockwork. Always paid cash. Always said thank you. Dorothea took the change, looked at Hollis. You knew him. Everyone knew Mr. Emmett, ma'am. Quiet fellow, but steady. The kind you could count on. Dorothea and Wallace drove back to the ranch in silence. When they arrived, Dorothea went straight to the cypress. The tree was even larger up close than from a distance. The trunk had a circumference two people couldn't have wrapped their arms around. The bark was marked by decades of drought and rain alternating, by branches that had grown and fallen and left scars in the trunk, like the wrinkles of a very old face. The canopy cast a shadow covering nearly 1,000 square feet of ground, and beneath the canopy the vegetation was different from the rest of the terrain. Denser in some places, thinner in others. Dorothea walked slowly around the trunk, studying the ground. And then she saw it. On the north side of the trunk, about 6 feet out there, was a flat stone. A field stone. Pink sandstone. Nothing extraordinary in appearance, but placed on the ground in a way that was clearly intentional. Not a stone the terrain had deposited there. A stone that someone had positioned, partially covered by grass, but the edge was too straight to be natural. Dorothea looked at Wallace. He looked at the stone. You're going to need that shovel, he said. Wallace offered to dig. Dorothea shook her head. No, I need to do this. She took the shovel, positioned it at the edge of the stone, and began to work. At 76, Dorothea was not the young woman who had worked the fields at 13. Her back ached after the first few minutes. Her hands, even in the gloves, began to blister. But she didn't stop. Wallace stood nearby. Didn't offer to take over, just watched. Handed her water when she needed it. The stone came out more easily than she expected. It had been placed as a lid, not buried deep. And beneath it, about 12 inches down, wrapped in a heavy-duty plastic bag, sealed with multiple layers of packing tape, was a barrel. Not an industrial metal drum. A round metal container. The kind that was once used for storing paint or spirits. About 16 inches in diameter and 2 feet tall. Wrapped in plastic that Emmett had put there to protect it from the damp earth. Wallace helped her pull it out. It was heavy. Not impossibly so, but solid. They set it on the ground beside the hole Dorothea had dug. The barrel was closed with a padlock. the same kind of old lock as the one on the house door. Dorothea took out the rusty key. Her hands were shaking now. She noticed. Didn't care. The key fit. Turned. The lock opened. Inside the barrel there was a sealed plastic folder. Inside the folder, documents. Dorothea pulled them out carefully, spread them on the ground in the shade of the cypress. Wallace knelt beside her. The first document was a deed. Property deed for Santa Rosa Ranch, Llano County, Texas. 25 acres. Transferred from Emmett Augustus Ashford to Dorothea Honoria Ashford. Date of transfer, May 15th, 2018. Notarized. Recorded. Official. The second was a savings account passbook. Account opened November 3rd, 1989. In the name of Dorothea Honoria Ashford. The last entry, dated July 20th, 2024, showed a balance of $60,127. The third was a geological report. 30 pages. Professional. Detailed. Dated March 2023. Hydrological assessment. Santa Rosa Ranch, Llano County, Texas. 4 natural springs identified. Chemical analysis included. pH 7.4. Temperature 58 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Flow rate viable for commercial production. Mineralization index exceptionally high. Sodium bicarbonate, calcium, magnesium. Water quality suitable for bottling and distribution. The fourth was an estimate. Concession value assessment. Based on market data from 2022 through 2024. Estimated value for 20-year exclusive concession rights to all 4 springs. $240,000 to $320,000. The fifth was a letter. On company letterhead, Clearwater Natural Springs Corporation. Dated September 2023. A pre-negotiation agreement. An expression of formal interest. We are pleased to present an opening proposal of $270,000 for a 20-year concession to develop and distribute mineral water from the springs located on the property known as Santa Rosa Ranch. And the sixth was a handwritten note. Emmett's writing. Attorney Antonio Valdez, Mexico City. He has copies of everything. Call when you're ready. Dorothea sat back on her heels, looked at the documents spread before her like cards in a hand she'd just been dealt, looked at the barrel, at the cypress tree towering above, at Wallace, who was reading the geological report with the careful attention of a man who had spent his career surveying land and understood exactly what he was looking at. Wallace looked up. Thea, these springs. This isn't just good water. This is rare, commercial grade. The kind companies spend years searching for. Dorothea picked up the deed, held it. Her name was on it. Had been for 6 years. 6 years during which Emmett had said nothing. Had let her believe the ranch was still his. Had kept the secret not out of deception, but out of protection. He did all this, she said quietly, and never told me. Wallace set down the geological report. Maybe he didn't know how. Or maybe he knew that if he told you, you'd tell him it was too much. That he didn't need to do all this. Dorothea looked at him. Would I have? Wallace smiled slightly. Probably. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Wallace said, "What's your next move?" Dorothea looked at the note with the attorney's name. "I call the lawyer, and then I figure out what these springs are worth." Back in town, Dorothea found a bench in the plaza. The morning sun was climbing, but not yet brutal. Birds made noise in the trees overhead. A few people crossed the square on their way to work or the market. Dorothea took out her phone, dialed the number Emmett had written. The phone rang 3 times. Then a man's voice answered. Antonio Valdez. "Mr. Valdez," Dorothea said. "This is Dorothea Ashford, Emmett's widow. I found the barrel." There was a pause. Then the man's voice came back warm with relief. "Mrs. Ashford, I've been waiting for your call. Your husband told me that when you called it would mean everything had gone as he hoped." He paused. "My condolences on his passing. He was a man of very clear vision." Dorothea looked across the plaza at the church. "Thank you. I need to know what to do next," Antonio Valdez explained. His voice was calm, methodical. The voice of a man who had been over this plan many times with Emmett and knew every step. "First, confirm the ranch deed at the local county office. It's already recorded, but you'll want a certified copy for your records. Second, activate the savings account. Take the passbook and your identification to any branch. Third, we need to discuss the mineral water concession. The company that sent the letter of interest is legitimate. They're one of the largest bottlers in the Southwest. But we shouldn't accept their opening offer." "What should we ask for?" Dorothea said. Antonio paused. "Based on the geological data and current market conditions, I'd advise countering at $380,000 for the 20-year term. We'll likely settle around $350,000. "And my children's lands?" Dorothea asked. The letter said something about environmental protection. There was a longer pause this time. "Yes. The lands Porter and Branch received are within a protected corridor established in 2019. Decree 247. Federal Environmental Protection. They're required to cease all grazing and agricultural activity within 90 days of notification. If they haven't been notified yet, they will be soon. The penalties for non-compliance start at $50,000. Dorothea was quiet. Then, "Do I need to tell them?" Antonio's voice was careful. "That's your choice, Mrs. Ashford. Legally, you have no obligation to inform them of regulatory issues with property they now own. But I understand they're your children." Dorothea thought about Porter taking the files from Emmett's study, about Branch's cattle count that came up short, about Jolene trying to claim the porcelain service, about Laverne suggesting the study become a guest room. "I won't tell them," she said. "They made their choices. This is mine." "Understood," Antonio said. "I'll send you the negotiation framework for the water company. Do you have legal representation locally?" Dorothea glanced at Wallace, who was sitting on another bench nearby, giving her space but staying close. "I have a friend who's a retired land surveyor. I'll handle the rest myself." There was something like admiration in Antonio's voice when he replied. "Mrs. Ashford, your husband said you were stronger than you knew. I'm beginning to see what he meant." Over the next weeks, Dorothea settled into a rhythm. She rented a room at Odette Rivers's guest house by the month, negotiated the rate herself, Odette had tried to give her a discount out of respect for Emmett, but Dorothea insisted on paying full price. Both women understood that charity that doesn't respect dignity isn't really charity at all. She set up a small kitchen corner in her room, bought a hot plate and a few pans. Cooking helped her think. It always had. The process of chopping and seasoning and stirring was the process by which she organized her mind. And her mind needed organizing. She called the contractor Odette had recommended, a man named Silas Morrow, 62 years old, who had learned the trade from his father and specialized in restoring old buildings. Silas drove out to the ranch, walked through the structure, knocked on walls, examined the roof beams, checked the foundation. "The structure is good," he said. "Old-growth hardwood doesn't rot if it was cured right in its day. You have a house here that will last another 100 years if you treat it well." He looked up at the collapsed roof. "The roof will have to be redone. The mud walls need to be repaired where they've fallen out. New windows, new flooring over the old cement don't remove it. It works as a base. Electric line is gonna need a new run from the road. About 600 feet of cable. Water, you've got the springs in the back that can be piped in with a simple pump." "How long?" Dorothea asked. 4 months if we work steady. 3 if I bring more hands." And how much? Silas did a mental calculation, looking at the ground, but calculating with precision. Material and labor, everything included, about 100,000. Maybe another 10 for surprises. Call it 110 to be safe. Dorothea looked at him. 85,000. Done in 12 weeks. And I'll give you a $5,000 bonus if you finish early without cutting corners." Silas looked back at her, studied her face. Then he smiled slightly, the smile of a man who recognized someone who knew what they want. Deal, Mrs. Ashford. Dorothea also hired help for the land clearing. Hollis Kane mentioned that his son Jasper, 18 years old and strong, was looking for work. Dorothea met with Jasper at the hardware store. He was tall, sunburned, with the easy energy of youth. "I need brush cleared," Dorothea told him. "Fence posts checked. General labor. $15 an hour. 6 in the morning to noon. 6 days a week." "Yes, ma'am," Jasper said immediately. "When do I start tomorrow?" Jasper showed up the next morning at exactly 6. Dorothea was already there, having driven out with Wallace. She showed Jasper what needed to be done. He set to work with a machete and a rhythm that made the work look easier than it was. At noon, Dorothea had lunch ready. She had bought a camp stove and set it up under what remained of the porch. She made sandwiches and coffee. Jasper ate with the focused attention of a young man who'd worked hard and was genuinely hungry. "This is good, ma'am," he said. "Thank you." "You're welcome. Be back tomorrow, same time." "Yes, ma'am." Wallace's role in all of this was careful, deliberate. He came out to the ranch 3 or 4 days a week, helped where Dorothea asked him to help, but never took over, never assumed control. When Silas had questions about where to run the electric line, Wallace surveyed the property and gave his professional opinion. But the final decision was always Dorothea's. What do you think she'd ask? "I think the eastern route makes more sense," Wallace would say. "Less digging, more direct. But it's your land, your call." And Dorothea would consider and decide, and Silas would follow her instructions. The town of Clearwater began to know her. Not as Emmett's widow, though that's how she'd arrived, but as herself. The woman restoring the old Ashford place. The woman who bought supplies at Ruby Collins' general store and paid in cash and always said thank you. The woman who hired local workers and treated them fairly. Ruby told her one afternoon standing behind the counter of the store. Mr. Emmett used to talk about you, you know. Said his wife was the kind of woman who does 3 things at once and does them all well. Dorothea was selecting canned goods. She stopped, looked at Ruby. He said that Ruby nodded. Every time he came in, he'd buy what he needed and sometimes he'd stay a few minutes to talk. Always about you. How you managed the house. How you raised the kids. He was proud, even if he didn't say it directly. Dorothea felt something catch in her throat. She paid for the groceries and left before Ruby could see her eyes water. That night, she sat in her room at the guest house and thought about Emmett. About the 40 years of trips. About the letter. About the barrel under the tree. About a man who couldn't say I love you with words, but had spent 4 decades saying it with actions. In September, a man named Dr. Nash Foster arrived at the ranch. He was in his 40s, a hydrology professor from the state university sent by the water company for a technical assessment before formal negotiations could begin. Dorothea met him at the gate, showed him the property, walked him to the springs which were at the back of the land in the low hollow Emmett had described in his letter. There were 4 of them, points where water rose from the ground clear and cold, pooling in natural depressions before draining away through the soil. Dr. Foster knelt beside each spring, took samples, measured temperature and pH on the spot, made notes in a leather journal. When he was finished, he looked up at Dorothea with something like reverence. Mrs. Ashford, these springs are extraordinary. The sodium bicarbonate index is higher than anything I've seen in this region. The water quality is pristine. If you don't mind my asking, how long have you known about these? My husband knew about them for over 30 years, Dorothea said. He kept them quiet. Dr. Foster nodded slowly. Smart man. Water like this word gets out, you'd have companies lined up. He paused. Would you consider allowing my graduate students to come out for a field study? It would help them enormously. We wouldn't disturb anything. Just observation and sampling. Dorothea considered. Yes, if it helps them learn. The students came in October. 6 of them young and enthusiastic with backpacks full of equipment. Dorothea cooked lunch for all of them, set up a table under the partially restored porch, and served sandwiches and fruit and sweet tea. The students ate gratefully, asked questions about the property, about the springs, about the history. One of them, a young woman named Marlowe, stayed after the others had gone back to their sampling. She helped Dorothea clean up the dishes. Did you always know about the springs? Marlowe asked as she dried a plate. No, Dorothea said. My husband knew. He kept it secret to protect it. Marlowe was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's beautiful. He must have loved you very much. Dorothea looked at her. This young woman who didn't know her didn't know Emmett, but had somehow understood in a sentence what had taken Dorothea months to fully grasp. He did, Dorothea said. I just didn't understand the language he was speaking. In November, the formal negotiations began. The water company sent a representative to meet with Dorothea at a hotel in the nearest city about 40 miles from Clearwater. Wallace drove her, sat in the lobby while she went into the conference room. The company president was there himself, a man named Callum Navarro in his early 50s with the polished demeanor of someone who'd closed 1,000 deals. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, shaking her hand. "Thank you for meeting with us. I've reviewed Dr. Foster's assessment. Your springs are exceptional. We're very interested in developing a partnership." They sat. Callum laid out the company's proposal. $270,000 for a 20-year exclusive concession. The company would handle all development, bottling, and distribution. Dorothea would receive the payment in 3 installments over the first 2 years. Dorothea listened, didn't interrupt. When he finished, she set her hands flat on the table. "Mr. Navarro, I've read your company's annual report. You paid $420,000 for springs in New Mexico 2 years ago. Those springs have half the flow rate of mine and a lower pH." She paused. "I'm asking for $380,000. 20-year term with a biennial review clause tied to production indices. And I want an environmental protection guarantee. Annual monitoring with reports sent directly to me." Callum's expression shifted. Surprise, then respect. "That's significantly above our opening position, Mrs. Ashford." Dorothea stood. "Then we have no agreement. Thank you for your time." She walked toward the door. "Wait," Callum said. She turned. "Let me count her. 320,000, fixed term, annual environmental report." Dorothea came back to the table but didn't sit. 350,000, biennial review. The environmental clause is non-negotiable. If you can't preserve the springs in perpetuity, I'll wait for a company that can. Callum looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. "Done. I'll have contracts drawn." Outside, Wallace stood when he saw her. "How'd it go?" Dorothea kept walking toward the truck. 350,000. Wallace stopped, stared. "You got 350? I got 350. In the truck, Wallace shook his head slowly. "You didn't need me in there at all, did you?" Dorothea looked out the window at the countryside passing. "I needed you to get me here, Wally. The rest was mine to do." But the peace didn't last. In March of 2025, 4 months after Emmett's death, Dorothea was at the ranch watching Silas's crew install the new roof beams when her phone rang. The screen said, "Porter." She let it ring twice more, then answered. Mother Porter's voice said, "Cold, controlled." "I went through some of Dad's study documents, the ones I took to organize. I found something." Dorothea waited. "A hydrological report about mineral water on the Llano County property." She said nothing. "You knew about this?" Porter's voice was tight. "Yes. Before the estate division, I found out after. But I know everything now." "Mother, we need to renegotiate. That land is worth substantially more than $32,000. If there's mineral water, if there's commercial value, that changes the valuation entirely. We need to meet and discuss a fair redistribution." Dorothea looked at Silas and his crew working on the roof, at the cypress tree standing tall against the blue sky, at Jasper clearing brush near the fence line. "Porter," she said quietly, "the ranch was transferred to my name in May of 2018. It was a gift from your father to me during his lifetime. It was never part of the 2024 estate. It's been mine for 6 years. Silence on the other end. Dad did that without telling us. Your father did what he had the right to do with his own property, Dorothea said. He gave it to me while he was alive, legally and completely. Porter's voice changed, became sharper. We'll challenge it. Undue influence, diminished capacity. There are grounds. Dorothea felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. Porter, you're welcome to try. The transfer was made 6 years ago when your father was 73 and in perfect health. It was notarized, witnessed, and recorded with the county. You'll spend $100,000 in legal fees to lose. This isn't over. You're right, Dorothea said. It isn't. Because you should also check the environmental compliance status on the land you and your siblings received. The Protected Corridor Decree from 2019. I believe enforcement carries significant penalties. She could hear Porter breathing on the other end of the line. If you want to visit me as my son, she continued, you're welcome any time. The gate is always open for family. But if you come to argue about money or property, you'll find it locked. She hung up. Her hands were shaking. She noticed. Sat down on the porch step. Put her head in her hands. Wallace, who had been standing near the truck and had heard enough to understand, came over. Sat beside her. You okay? Dorothea looked up. I just stood up to my son. For the first time in 48 years. How does it feel? She thought about it. Terrifying. And right. Wallace nodded. That's usually how the right thing feels. April came to Llano County with wildflowers. Bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush turning the scrubland into something that looked deliberate, plan-like. Someone had taken a brush to the countryside and decided it needed color. The ranch was different now. Silas and his crew had finished the roof. New clay tiles that caught the light the way the old ones must have a century ago. The walls were patched, reinforced, the gaps filled with fresh mud mixture, made the traditional way. The windows were painted a deep blue that Dorothea had chosen from a sample card, and the porch had been extended and covered. It looked like a place someone lived. Not ruins. Not abandoned. A home. Dorothea was sitting on that porch in one of 2 chairs she'd bought in town when she saw the car coming down the dirt road. A silver SUV, clean. City clean. She recognized it before it reached the gate. Jolene. The car stopped. Jolene got out alone. Her husband, Eli, stayed in the passenger seat window up air conditioning, probably running. Jolene stood by the car for a moment, looking at the house at the porch. At the garden, Jasper had helped Dorothea clear where she'd planted herbs and 3 rose bushes she'd brought as cuttings from the city house. Dorothea stayed in her chair. Waited. Jolene walked up. She looked thinner than she had at the funeral. Older, somehow, though it had only been months. There was a line between her eyebrows that hadn't been there before. Mom, she said. Jolene. Can I sit? Dorothea gestured to the other chair. Jolene sat. She looked at her hands for a moment, then out at the cypress tree. It's beautiful out here, Jolene said. I didn't expect it to be beautiful. It's becoming beautiful, Dorothea corrected. A pause. The kind that stretches and fills with all the things not being said. Porter told me about the phone call, Jolene said finally. About the ranch being in your name since 2018. About the springs. Dorothea said nothing. We got worried, Jolene continued. Branch and I. About you out here alone in a town you don't know making decisions about hundreds of thousands of dollars. We thought maybe you'd want to come back to the city, to the house. We could revisit the estate division, make sure everything's fair. Dorothea set her coffee cup down on the small table between the chairs. Slowly. Precisely. Fair, she said. Jolene looked at her. Dorothea leaned forward slightly. I want you to listen to me. Not as a daughter who came here to negotiate. As my daughter. Jolene's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Do you remember the day you divided your father's estate 3 weeks after his funeral? I sat in that lawyer's office and watched you and your brothers split 865 acres, 400 cattle, equipment, bank accounts. You gave me 25 acres you called worthless. We didn't think it was valuable. Jolene started. Dorothea held up a hand. I'm not finished. Jolene stopped. You measured the walls of my living room for renovation plans while I was still trying to understand that your father was dead. Porter took files from Emmett's study after I asked him not to. Branch adjusted the cattle count in his favor. You tried to claim the porcelain service your father gave me on our 35th anniversary. Dorothea's voice was steady, not loud, but it had weight. I spent 55 years holding up a considerable portion of what you divided among yourselves. I never asked for a receipt. I never demanded credit. But I will not pretend what happened didn't happen. And I will not give up what your father protected for me just because it causes you inconvenience. Jolene's face had gone pale. Mom, I didn't know about the environmental order. Dorothea looked at her directly. What environmental order? The land Porter and Branch and I received. Porter hired a lawyer. The lawyer found out it's in some kind of protected zone. We can't graze cattle on it. Can't develop it. There are fines if we don't comply. $50,000 to start. Dorothea had known this was coming. Antonio Valdez had told her enforcement would arrive eventually. She hadn't known it would be this soon. I see, she said. Did you know, Jolene asked, when we divided everything? Did you know about the protection order? Dorothea met her daughter's eyes. Your father's letter mentioned it. He didn't create the protection zone. The state did. In 2019. But he didn't warn you about it either. So you knew, Jolene said. And you didn't tell us. You gave me land you called worthless without checking what it was actually worth, Dorothea said. I didn't volunteer information about land that was no longer my concern. Jolene stood up. Her hands were shaking. What about the other ranch, the one Porter and Branch got? There's a lawsuit. Some farmer claiming adverse possession. Did you know about that too? I knew your father's lawyer had let the defense lapse, yes. And you said nothing. Dorothea stood as well. Jolene, listen to me carefully. I did not create these problems. Your father didn't create them. But he also didn't protect you from them. He protected me. Because he knew what you would do when he died. And he was right. Jolene's eyes were wet now. So this is it. This is how it ends. You out here with your springs and your money and us scrambling to salvage what's left. Dorothea felt something twist in her chest. Not satisfaction. Something sadder. No. This is how it begins. Me standing on my own. You learning that the choices you make have consequences. And us? Jolene asked. Your children. Dorothea stepped closer. You will always be my children, until the day I die. But I will not pretend the last 6 months didn't happen. I will not hand over what's mine because you've discovered it has value. And I will not feel guilty for surviving what you tried to do to me. Jolene's face crumpled. She turned, walked back to the car, got in. Didn't look back as Eli pulled away the SUV, kicking up dust on the road. Dorothea stood on the porch and watched them disappear. She felt hollow. Empty in a way that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite relief. Just a space where something used to be. Ruby Collins came up the drive 20 minutes later in her old pickup. She got out carrying a basket covered with a kitchen towel. Saw Jolene leaving, Ruby said. Figured you might need company. Under the towel were fresh biscuits, still warm, and a jar of honey. They sat on the porch together. Didn't talk much. Sometimes the best company is the kind that doesn't require words. The consequences for the children unfolded over the following months, like a slow-motion collapse. Dorothea didn't seek out the information, didn't ask. But Clearwater was a small town, and small towns have ears. Information flowed whether you wanted it or not. Ruby mentioned one afternoon while Dorothea was buying flour and sugar at the general store that she'd heard Porter had sold his portion of the protected land. Sold it at a steep loss to some real estate investment fund that specialized in buying problem properties. Got about 60% of what it was supposedly worth. Ruby didn't say it with satisfaction, just stated it as fact. The way you'd mentioned the weather. Dorothea nodded. Didn't comment. Odette, the innkeeper, mentioned a few weeks later that she'd run into Jolene's husband, Eli, at a gas station, halfway between Clearwater and the city. He'd looked stressed. Said something about legal fees. About environmental compliance attorneys costing more than they'd expected. Again, Dorothea just listened. Took the information in. Felt that same hollow space where judgment or satisfaction or vindication should have been. Silas Morrow mentioned while he and his crew were finishing the interior work that he'd heard through a contractor friend that Branch was having some trouble. Something about the agricultural board investigating discrepancies in livestock counts. Silas didn't know the details, just that there was an investigation. Dorothea thanked him for the information, went back inside, sat at the new kitchen table Silas had built from reclaimed wood and put her head in her hands. Wallace found her like that an hour later. He'd driven out to drop off some surveying maps he'd found that showed the original property boundaries from when Emmett's grandfather had first claimed the land. He sat down across from her. Didn't ask what was wrong. Just waited. I didn't want this, Dorothea said finally. I didn't want them to suffer. Wallace was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You didn't cause their suffering, Thea. Their choices did. There's a difference between consequence and cruelty. Is there? Dorothea looked up. Because right now it feels like the same thing. Wallace leaned back in his chair. When Sarah was sick, those last months, her sister came to visit. Hadn't spoken to Sarah in 15 years over some family argument I never fully understood. She showed up at the hospital wanting to make peace, wanting forgiveness. Dorothea listened. Sarah forgave her, Wallace continued. Told her she loved her. Told her it was okay. But she also told her that forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. That they couldn't go back to how things were before. That the relationship had changed, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. He looked at Dorothea. Her sister was angry. Wanted everything to go back to normal. Wanted the 15 years to disappear because Sarah had said the words, "I forgive you." But Sarah held firm. She said, you can forgive someone and still protect yourself from them. That's not cruelty. That's survival. Dorothea thought about that. About Emmett's letter. About the barrel under the tree. About 40 years of preparation. All of it designed to make sure she could survive. Thank you, she said quietly. Wallace stood, patted her shoulder once, then left her to her thoughts. In late November, the contract was finalized. Antonio Valdez had negotiated every clause, every term, every protection. Dorothea traveled to Mexico City with Wallace for the signing. It took place in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and Dorothea felt deeply out of place in her simple dress and practical shoes, while Callum Navarro and his team wore suits that probably cost more than her first car. But when she signed her name on the line, Dorothea Honoria Ashford and the notary stamped the document, and Callum shook her hand and said, "Congratulations." She felt something shift. $350,000, 20-year concession, biennial review clause, environmental protections in perpetuity. The ranch still hers. The spring still hers. Just the rights to bottle and sell the water going to the company. Antonio walked her out after. In the elevator, he said, "Your husband would be very proud, Mrs. Ashford." Dorothea looked at her reflection in the polished elevator doors. "I hope so." "He knew you'd do this," Antonio said. "He told me the last time we met that you were stronger than you believed. That when the time came, you'd know exactly what to do." "When was the last time you met?" Dorothea asked. "June of 2024, Antonio said. 2 months before he died. He came to finalize some documents, to make sure everything was in order. He knew he was running out of time. The elevator doors opened. They stepped out into the marble lobby. He never said anything, Dorothea said. Never told me he knew." Antonio stopped, looked at her with something like compassion. "Maybe he didn't want you to carry that weight, knowing he was dying. Maybe he wanted you to remember him as he was not as he was becoming." Dorothea felt tears prick her eyes, blinked them back. "Thank you, Mr. Valdez, for everything. It was my honor, Mrs. Ashford." That night in a hotel room in Mexico City, Wallace took Dorothea to dinner at a quiet restaurant Antonio had recommended. They sat by a window overlooking a small plaza lit with strings of lights. Wallace raised his glass of wine. "To Emmett, and to you." Dorothea clinked her glass against his. "To never being too late." They drank, ate. The food was good, but Dorothea barely tasted it. Her mind was elsewhere, on the ranch, on the Cypress. on Emmett's letter that she'd read so many times she could recite it from memory. After dinner, walking back to the hotel through streets busy with evening crowds, Wallace said, "I need to tell you something." Dorothea looked at him. "These months, helping you with the ranch, being part of this, it's given me something I didn't think I'd have again." "What's that?" "Purpose," Wallace said. "When Sarah died, I thought I was done. Done mattering. Done being needed. I sold my surveying business, sat in my house, watched television, waited. For what?" Wallace shrugged. "I don't know. The end, I guess." He looked at her. "You gave me something to do, someone to help, a reason to get up in the morning. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know. You weren't the only one who needed saving." Dorothea stopped walking. They were in front of a small church, its doors open, candlelight flickering inside. She looked at Wallace, really looked at him. This man who had driven her 150 miles without asking why, who had stood by while she dug in the dirt, who had sat silent in negotiations, who had been there always without demanding anything in return. "Wally," she said, "I'm not ready for anything. Emmett's only been gone a year." "I know," Wallace said quickly. "I'm not asking you to be ready. I'm just telling you I'm here. For however long you need. In whatever way you need." Dorothea reached out, took his hand, squeezed it once. "Thank you." They stood there for a moment, holding hands in front of a church in Mexico City. Two people in their 70s who had both lost everything and were learning how to build something new from what remained. Then Dorothea let go, and they walked back to the hotel in comfortable silence. December arrived cold and clear, the first real cold of winter, the kind that makes you believe summer was a dream. The ranch was finished. Silas had done exactly what he promised. The house stood solid and beautiful, white lime-washed walls gleaming in the winter sun, blue-painted trim around the windows and doors. The porch extended and covered two comfortable chairs positioned to look out over the land toward the Cypress. The interior was simple but complete. A main room with the old mesquite table refinished and sturdy. A small kitchen with propane stove and a sink connected to the spring water. A bedroom at the back with a window facing east, so the morning light would wake her gently. Electricity throughout, powered by the lines Silas's crew had run from the road. Heat from a small wood stove Hollis Kane had helped her install. It was everything Dorothea needed, and nothing she didn't. She moved in on a Saturday in mid-December. Wallace helped her bring her things from the guest house. It didn't take many trips. Dorothea had never been one to accumulate. The few clothes she owned, the cooking equipment she'd bought, the porcelain service from her 35th anniversary that she'd gone back to the city house to retrieve when Porter and Jolene weren't there. Emmett's letter in a cedar box. A photograph of them on their wedding day, young and hopeful, and unaware of everything that would come. Odette stood on the porch of the guest house and waved as they drove away for the last time. "You come back and visit," she called. "You hear me? I will." Dorothea called back. The first night in the house, Dorothea sat on the porch as the sun went down. The sky turned orange, then pink, then deep purple. The cypress stood black against it, enormous and ancient and permanent. Stars began to appear. More stars than she'd seen in years living in the city where light pollution washed them out. She thought about Emmett, about the monthly trips, about him sitting maybe in this exact spot or near it looking at this same tree planting. Always planning. Building something in silence that would only be discovered after he was gone. She thought about the children, about Porter's cold calculation, about Jolene's uncomfortable complicity, about Branch's opportunism, about Laverne, the youngest, who had stayed quiet through it all. And she thought about herself, about who she had been a year ago, signing papers in a lawyer's office and accepting scrubland as her portion. About who she was, now sitting on a porch she owned on land she owned with more money in the bank than she'd ever imagined having. The transformation hadn't been dramatic, hadn't been a lightning strike, had been slow, incremental, one decision at a time, one conversation, one moment of standing up instead of sitting down. Inside, she made coffee on the new stove, sat at the mesquite table, opened the cedar box, and took out Emmett's letter. Read it again, though she knew every word. You were never what was left over. You were what was set aside. She folded it carefully, put it back, closed the box. Outside, an owl called. The wind moved through the cypress branches with a sound like water. Dorothea went to bed in her new house in the room Emmett had protected for 40 years and slept deeply for the first time since he died. The phone call came 2 weeks later. December 23rd. Dorothea was baking bread. The kitchen warm and smelling of yeast and flour when her phone rang. Laverne's name on the screen. Dorothea almost didn't answer. Let it ring 3 times, 4. Then picked up. Mom Laverne's voice said. And then nothing else, just crying. Dorothea sat down at the table. Laverne more crying. Then I'm so sorry, Mom. I knew it was wrong. When Porter laid out the division. When we all agreed to it. I knew it was wrong and I stayed quiet. I should have spoken up. Should have said something. Dorothea listened. Didn't interrupt. I've been thinking about it for months. Laverne continued. About Dad. About what he would think. About what kind of person stays quiet when something wrong is happening just because it's easier than speaking up. The crying intensified. I'm not asking for anything. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I know. That I'm sorry. Dorothea closed her eyes. Saw Laverne at 6 years old learning to ride a bike. At 16 graduating high school. At 25 showing Dorothea the ring Marcus had given her. At 38 tired and overwhelmed with twin 6-year-olds. Still trying to be a good mother. And a good architect. And a good daughter. And failing at all of it because no one can be everything to everyone. Laverne, she said, can you come see me? A pause. Really? Really? When? Whenever you can. Bring the twins if you want. Laverne arrived 2 days after Christmas. The day was bright and cold. She drove up in her practical sedan Finn and Briar in the back seat. Both of them pressed against the windows, trying to see everything at once. The twins exploded out of the car the moment it stopped. Ran toward the cypress tree like they'd been pulled by magnets. Laverne got out more slowly. She looked like she hadn't slept well in months. "Mom," she said. Dorothea stepped off the porch, walked to her daughter, and hugged her. Laverne broke, just completely broke, sobbed into Dorothea's shoulder the way she used to when she was small and had scraped her knee or lost a toy or been frightened by thunder. "I'm sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry." "I know," Dorothea said. "I know you are." They stood like that for a long time, until Laverne's breathing steadied, until the tears slowed. Then Dorothea pulled back, looked at her daughter's face. "You're here now. That's what matters." They spent the weekend together. Laverne helped in the kitchen. They cooked meals the way they used to when Laverne was young and learning. They talked carefully at first, then more freely. About Emmett, about the ranch, about the springs, about what had happened with Porter and Branch and Jolene. The twins ran wild on the property, climbed the Cypress or tried to getting a few feet up before sliding back down. Explored the springs under Dorothea's careful supervision. Found a rabbit burrow and spent an hour watching it, hoping to see the rabbits emerge. On Sunday morning before they left, Briar, the quieter of the twins, came to Dorothea on the porch. She was holding something in her cupped hands. "Grandma," she said, "does the tree have a name?" Dorothea knelt down to her level. "It does. His name is Augustus." Briar nodded seriously, as if receiving important information she intended to remember. "That's a good name for a tree." "I think so too." Briar opened her hands. Inside was a small, smooth stone she must have found by the springs. "Can I keep this to remember?" "Of course you can." Briar closed her hands again. Carefully, protectively. "Thank you." When Laverne's car pulled away, Finn and Briar waving from the back window, Dorothea stood at the gate and waved back until they disappeared around the bend. Then she turned and looked at the ranch, at the house, at the Cypress, at the land that had been worthless scrubland 6 months ago and was now the foundation of a new life. Not a restart, not a do-over, just a continuation, a next chapter. Wallace came by that afternoon, found her sitting on the porch with coffee watching the winter light change the color of the grass. "How was the visit?" he asked. "Good," Dorothea said. "Really good." He sat in the other chair. They sat in silence for a while. Then Wallace said, "I'm heading back to the city tomorrow. My daughter wants me there for New Year's. But I'll be back next week if you need anything." Dorothea looked at him. This man who had become something more than a neighbor, something more than a friend, something she wasn't quite ready to name but recognized as important. "Thank you, Wally, for everything, for the rides, for the help, for just being here." Wallace smiled. "Nowhere else I'd rather be." After he left, as the sun was setting and the sky was doing that thing it does in winter where it looks like fire, Dorothea went inside, got the cedar box, took out Emmett's letter one more time. She read it slowly, savoring it, not crying this time, just reading, just understanding. When she got to the end, to the part where he said, "I love you. I always knew how to say it on the inside, I took too long to learn how to say it on the outside. Forgive me, she spoke out loud. I forgive you, she said, to the empty room, to the memory of a man who had loved her in silence for 55 years. And I understand now what you were trying to say, what you spent 40 years saying. She put the letter back in the box, set it on the shelf above the kitchen counter where she could see it every day. Then she went outside one more time, walked across the yard to the cypress in the gathering dark, put her hand on the bark, felt the roughness of it, the age, the permanence. This tree had been planted in 1905 by a man named Augustus, who claimed land that wasn't his to claim, and made it his by the force of will and work. It had stood through droughts and floods, through the lives and deaths of generations, through Emmett's grandfather and father and Emmett himself. And now it stood witness to Dorothea, to a 76-year-old woman who had been invisible for most of her life and had discovered finally that she had never been forgotten. She stood there as the stars came out, as the temperature dropped, as the night sounds of the countryside began their familiar chorus. And she thought about what she would tell someone if they asked about this year, about losing Emmett and the children's betrayal, and the ranch and the springs and the money. She would tell them it wasn't about the money. The money was just proof, evidence, documentation of something deeper. It was about being seen, about a man who couldn't say I love you with words, but said it with 40 years of monthly trips, with a deed transferred in secret, with a barrel buried under a tree, with a letter that explained everything he'd never been able to explain in life. It was about discovering that worth isn't determined by what others give you or take away. It's determined by what you know about yourself, by what you're willing to stand up for, by the boundaries you set and the dignity you demand. It was about learning that it's never too late, not at 76, not at any age. Never too late to claim what's yours, to fight for what matters, to become who you always were but didn't know how to be. Dorothea walked back to the house, made dinner, ate at the table Silas had built, washed the dishes in water from the springs Emmett had protected. Then she sat in the armchair by the wood stove and opened a book, read until her eyes grew heavy, got ready for bed, lay down in the dark and listened to the house settle around her. In the morning she would wake to sunlight through the east window, would make coffee, would sit on the porch and watch the day begin, would continue the work of living, of building, of being. But tonight she slept, and in her dreams she was young again, standing in a general store, watching cans of lard roll across a dirt floor, bending down to help a quiet young man pick them up, meeting his eyes, seeing something there she recognized even then, though she had no words for it yet, seeing the future, their future, all of it laid out in a single moment of kindness, and helping a stranger pick up what he dropped. In the dream, she knew everything that would come, the marriage, the children, the work, the silence, the monthly trips, the letter, the ranch, the springs, the cypress, all of it. And she bent down anyway, picked up the cans anyway, met his eyes anyway, because some things are worth it. even knowing how hard it will be, even knowing how it will end. Some things are worth every single moment. When Dorothea woke, the sun was streaming through the window, and the birds were singing, and the cypress was standing tall against the morning sky, just as it had for 120 years, just as it would for 100 more. She got up, made coffee, sat on the porch, and began again.